I could never design my own sweater.
Do you have a pattern for that?
I can barely even follow regular knitting patterns.
I like the idea of self-drafting, but I can't actually do it.
Have you or a loved one been affected by self-doubt? We're gonna address that today. So my very first knit sweater was self-drafted. I was way too intimidated by knitting patterns that I just went for it. I am so glad that I did that sweater because it gave me some very unwarranted confidence when it came to making my own sweaters moving forward. And I'm surprised by how many people are like so intimidated by it because it's just a couple basic principles. And once you have those, or like are even aware of them, in my mind at least, it's not all that complicated. So I wrote down what my approach is to self-drafting, and I'm going to show you that. It might not be the way that your brain works, but I think for a handful of people, this might help. The approach. Some of y'all are so intimidated by designing your own patterns, and I think not even designing your own patterns, designing your own sweaters. You don't have to write a pattern for it. And I think some people don't remember or don't know that there are different levels of self-drafting. So you don't just have to sketch out a design that's completely original and figure it all out on your own. Like, I think you're making it a little more complicated than it needs to be. And so if you're someone that's really intimidated by self-drafting, I would recommend moving up this like sliding scale of self-drafting. Instead of just going from 0 to 100, maybe experiment along the spectrum around here. And a lot of people are probably doing this without necessarily realizing that they're doing this. So let's say we have our spectrum here, and on one end we have following a pattern, and on the other end we have designing and creating your own original sweater. I would say a little baby step up from following a knitting pattern is altering a knitting pattern. I feel comfortable saying that I think most people do that, at least on some level, whether that be making sleeves a little bit longer, a little bit tighter. It doesn't have to be a big change or anything dramatic, but just a little thing where you're saying, hey pattern, thank you for getting me this far, but I'm gonna do something else instead. Then I would say a step up from that, we have referencing a pattern. To me, this means using a pattern as a baseline. So let's take Kudavakika's Cinema Sweater, for example. It is a very simple, staple raglan knit sweater. In my mind, if I was referencing this pattern, I would be following step by step with the same things that she did in this pattern, except I would probably do a different gauge. Maybe I would add all over ribbing on the whole thing. Maybe I would do some color work. So I'm still following the equation of the sweater in the pattern, but I'm not actually following the pattern. Come here, Pippin. Next on the spectrum, I would say we have referencing a construction or technique. So in this case, it's most of what I do, and it would apply to this as well. To me, this is referencing and utilizing a raglan construction. No single pattern owns raglan construction. A lot of patterns reference it. When I went to make this sweater, I knew the basics of how to make raglan sweater, and I just decided, okay, how many stitches did I want between my raglan seams? What was the ratio between body and arm that I wanted? But I wasn't reinventing the wheel. A step above that is coming up with an original design. This and anything above it, I think, is a little bit more rare to see, but it would be inventing or creating a new construction that you maybe haven't seen before. I think original design, it's a bit of a gray area, just like this whole thing, it's a spectrum. But to me, creating an original design without referencing an existing construction would involve coming up with your own new construction or a way of putting together a sweater that you haven't seen before. And I would say for this, like, if you're not writing a pattern, no one's gonna be going up to you with a monocle saying, that sweater seems to be referencing a construction from an 18th century painting of a sweater I once saw. So that's why I think it's a bit of a gray area. Next up, we have freeform. So this is getting away from traditional construction entirely. Freeform sweaters, in my mind, are ones that they can be planned, are a little bit more organic in shape, and tend to lean on the more improvised side of things. Very interesting, typically very unique, but in essence, I think freeform is just breaking away from the traditional definition of a constructed sweater. And kind of outside of this spectrum in its own little area is copying a design based on an existing sweater. And this one is also in sort of a moral gray area. In my opinion, I think anything that you see on fast fashion websites or like big box stores, I think that's up for grabs. Like if I see a sweater on Anthropologie and I'm like, I could knit that. I don't see any problem with me knitting that. I'm not going to write a pattern and sell it, but I feel comfortable doing that. The main thing I want you to take away from this is you do not have to reinvent the wheel every single time you go to self-draft a sweater. There are different skills and techniques you can utilize in order to make self-drafting a sweater a little bit more approachable. So for the rest of this video, I'm going to be focusing on referencing a construction or technique and following that, because that's usually what I do when I go to self-draft. Also, I know I haven't said it yet, but a lot of these principles can apply to either knitting or crochet, but I will be using the language of knitting just because I don't want to list every single fiber art every time I explain something. Phase 1, pick a construction. This is the biggest decision. There are many different ways that you can approach this, so I think you can go the route of picking a construction and building your sweater off of that, or you can kind of sketch out or design a sweater or have an idea in your mind and pick a construction that you think could get you to that result. There are infinite sweater constructions out in the universe. Type into the old YouTube search bar how to knit a raglan sweater and you will find dozens of videos explaining how to do it. When you're starting out though, I would recommend just picking a basic construction, potentially one you've even done before when following a pattern. And a good jumping off point when it comes to picking a construction is to answer the following questions. The first question to ask yourself is if you want something to be seamless or seamed. Seamless sweaters are knit in one piece, typically in the round. They can be done top down or bottom up, and you avoid the need of sewing pieces together at the end. There are a ton of really interesting, more advanced techniques to getting seamless sweaters to fit really well, but for the most part, seamless sweaters tend to have a little bit more of a relaxed fit to them. Seamed sweaters are a lot more versatile when it comes to fit generally. There's a little bit more you can do. As it sounds, seamed sweaters is when you knit individual pieces and then sew them together, typically at the end. They usually offer a sense of structure, and they can range from being incredibly relaxed fit to being really tailored to your body in a way that might be a little bit more difficult to achieve in a seamless sweater. I have been known to do a combination of these where part of the sweater is seamed together and part of it is done in the round. If you're going more of the seamless route, the next question to answer would be if you want to do it top down or bottom up. I love doing top down. I think a lot of people really like doing top down because, especially when you're doing self-drafting, because you get to try it on as you're going and testing out the fit. And if you mess up, you don't have to peel back usually as much as you would if you were doing it bottom up. The benefit to doing bottom up is a lot of people don't like doing like make one right or make one left or adding stitches, but they don't mind as much decreasing stitches. So if that's more your preference, then bottom up's the way to go. Now, once you've picked if you want it to be seam, seamless, top down, bottom up, there are so many different potential shoulder constructions. When it comes to seam sweaters, you can do drop shoulder, which is having straight sleeves that are attached at the body of the sweater without any sort of shaping. And I mean shaping at the armhole, like you can shape the sleeve all you want, but the part where you're actually attaching it to the body of the sweater isn't shaped. They generally have a more relaxed, casual vibe to them. The other option with seaming is you can do set-in sleeves. This is when you knit the body and the sleeve separately and you sew them together at the end. There's usually some shoulder shaping going on so that you can get a more tailored fit. If you were going the seamless route in the round, there are lots of different yoke options that you can pick from. Some of the more common ones tend to be circular yoke. This is generally the pick when it comes to doing circular, like Fair Isle color work. It's also pretty popular with lace work. There's raglan construction, which is what I'm wearing now. That was the first one that I had ever learned, where you're doing increases at specific portions and it creates this sort of like diagonal line, almost like a seam that runs from the neckline to the underarm. This can also be done top down, bottom up. There is the saddle shoulder yoke, where the shoulder section extends up to the neckline. This design provides a more structured look, in my opinion. It can be done a lot of ways and tends to look really good if you're going for an all-over cabling or doing something with a lot of texture. There's also a contiguous yoke. This is a fun one to do. It mimics set-in sleeves, but is done seamlessly. This one's typically done top down, I think, with the yoke and the shoulders shaped in one just continuous piece. Some other fun ones to mention are side-to-side sweaters. I really want to make one of these where you're just going end to end. There are patchwork, freeform, modular, block construction sweaters. I'm lumping these all into the same category. These are done by creating different shapes, blocks, and then joining them all together into one piece. This can be a really fun technique for beginners because there's a lot of flexibility involved in it. which is funny because I think that this is the one that intimidates people like a lot. It's also more popular in crochet than it is in knitting, and I think that's such a loss for the knitting world. Like, we should be having more fun with patchwork sweaters. There are steeked sweaters, which are knit in the round and then cut. Well, they're usually cardigans. That's not true. I guess you can steek for sleeves. Anyways, you're knitting them in the round and not creating any sort of openings in there, and then you give it the old snip snip to create different openings. This one I have not tried and I would love to. So yeah, there are so many different construction options, and that was just the tip of the iceberg. But I think when people are just first approaching it, it's best not to overwhelm and to just start with the simple constructions. The nice thing about picking a construction too, when you're self-drafting for the first few times, is you don't have to know how to do it inherently by yourself. So you can look at patterns that maybe you already purchased that follow a similar construction that you're trying to do, and using the same ideologies that they follow in the pattern. And like I said, you can also look up YouTube tutorials for literally how to do a circular yoke sweater, where it's not necessarily giving you a pattern, but it's telling you how you approach a circular yoke. A couple of tips in the world of construction is I like having knitting books laying around. I use knitting books more so for inspiration than for the knitting patterns themselves. And I also use them as a source of reference. So if I see that like there's a sweater in a magazine that I bought that follows a construction that I'm very interested in, maybe they did a saddle shoulder, I'll read through the pattern to try to figure out how did they achieve a saddle shoulder and then apply that method to whatever I'm doing. So I'm not really following the pattern as much as using it as a jumping off point for knowing what are the basic steps. Another tip is to maybe try and copy store-bought sweaters that you already have and love at home, and trying to copy the construction type that they did. A lot of store-bought sweaters tend to be seamed, and a lot of like more modern ones, especially in the United States, are like pretty relaxed fit. And so it's usually just like a whole bunch of rectangles and maybe some neckline shaping. Another tip when it comes to actually executing the construction is to actually, especially if you're doing it top down, don't start with the collar. I would recommend. That was a mistake that I did a lot when I first started self-drafting, and I've had to undo and redo a lot of collars on old pieces, and I had a whole video about how I did that with this one. What I would recommend doing instead is starting at the yoke portion when you're going top down and doing the shoulder part and the yoke portion. And then before you split for sleeves, then going back or maybe even later and doing the collar. The reason I would recommend doing this is the math only gets you so far, especially when you're starting out. And if you're using yarns that you aren't like totally familiar with, it is very probable that maybe your neckline will be too open, or it won't come down as far as you want. And maybe it's not as thick as you would like, or you went for a double folded collar, but now you're like, I don't think that would look good with the yoke that I've done here. So I just think it's better to do the collar after you've done the yoke so that you would know what would look best. Phase 2, decide on flair. This would be the things that spice up the sweater. Now, if you're already self-drafting with a fully formed idea in mind, then you've already done this section. You don't need to think about this. But if you picked a construction and now you want to like spice it up a little bit, so it's like, great, I'm gonna keep using the example of top-down raglan seamless sweater. I can spice that up in a lot of ways. One of those ways would be picking a different stitch type. So maybe not just doing stockinette stitch. Maybe I want to do garter stitch, moss stitch, play around with different like rib techniques. 2x1, 3x1, 4x1, 5x8, whatever, having fun with it. Maybe doing a checkerboard thing with stitch types where you knit 3 purl and knit 3 knits. This is the kind of thing where you can totally utilize Pinterest and look for different stitch Bibles or like reference books. Libraries will sometimes have these. Another flair thing you can do is looking at cables, which if you haven't done them yet, they seem a lot more complicated than they are. There are also faux cabling options. You can look up tutorials for this, same thing. You can do a simple 3-stitch repeat cable where you're doing the same thing over and over again. And the fun thing about cables is if you do it a certain way, then you're just doing regular stockinette stitch for like 8 rounds, and then you do the cabling for 1 round, and then you go back to regular stockinette stitch for 8 rounds. So it's fun because it can be engaging and mindless simultaneously. and it always looks impressive. Like cabling always looks impressive. Similarly, lace, having fun with lace techniques. For this, I actually have, I think it's called like the Japanese Stitch Bible, which has a lot of different lace stitch ideas put into it with like actual charts on how to do that lace. And that's such a fun thing where you could just apply that to a regular raglan sweater. And now it's all of a sudden a cool lace sweater that I designed myself. Color work is such a fun thing. And there's so many different ways to do it. So coming up with a stranded color work idea, maybe doing some duplicate stitch, even just adding stripes. There's so many different fun ways to do color work. And I think like the cousin of color work would be embroidery. And that's kind of fun because you can do that afterwards. So you don't need to like decide on that. You can just do your basic sweater pattern and then add embroidery on top of that. Same with duplicate stitch. My tip for this section is really just to find references. So go to your local library and find reference books and stitch Bibles, or buy them if you really want them. Look up YouTube videos, go on Pinterest. There are so many different resources for looking at different types of knitting and crochet stitches and seeing what's out there. Did I say crochet? I did not say that correctly. Phase 3, preparation. This is going to be a lot of repeats from my like how to knit sweaters for other people video, but it applies to this as well. So picking a yarn, do whatever you want. It's self-drafted. Have fun with it. Pick a yarn that you like. Pick a yarn that you don't like for some reason. When it comes to picking a yarn, just general good yarn advice is keeping aware of your allergies and sensitivities, keeping an eye on your budget. Always, especially when self-drafting, pick up more yarn or make sure you have more yarn on hand than you think you'll actually need. Consider the level of upkeep you're willing to put into something, and consider your lifestyle as well as location. So does it need to be on the warmer side or does it need to be like easy breezy? And then consider what would just genuinely look good with the vibe that you're going for. So there's a lot of flexibility in this really. This one's just a very basic top-down raglan seamless sweater, and I did it in a 100% cotton yarn. This would have also been cool, but a little different if I had done it in a wool yarn or like a fluffy alpaca, maybe some mohair action going on, making it really fluffy. I knew that I wanted something to be like really breezy, everyday wear, comfortable, not itchy, decent for most seasons. So for me, cotton was like the obvious choice here. Like the yarn section could be a whole video in itself. So I'm just like spitting out everything I can think of. But so like just consider how much structure do you want? Do you want it to be really structured? Do you want it to be really drapey? And if you want it to be really drapey, just Google drapey yarns, and that the Google machine will spit out answers for you. If you have a question in your head, just type it right into that search bar. I think people have like really forgotten that the internet is a resource. You don't need to have like a single person holding your hand. You got this. You can fill in the gaps. You can do it. I believe in you. The big thing to consider in the preparation portion is measurements. As usual, good advice is I would highly recommend you just go into your closet, pick a sweater that you already own that you like, or a top or something, and measure that bad boy and use that as your jumping off point. This is the very basic template that I use to decide on what overall measurements I need for my sweaters. And at this point, you are now ready to make a swatch. I think swatches are incredibly important when it comes to self-drafting, more so than when you're following a pattern. When you are self-drafting, you have to decide how many stitches am I casting on when I go to start. And that's the information you're going to get from your swatch. So here is a really good video on figuring out gauge, so you can get really detailed information. And I have that linked in the description. But just like a quick hit of how to do it is I would make a big swatch. When I go to measure my swatch, just lay out my handy dandy ruler and I count stitches. And usually, I honestly, when I'm self-drafting, I don't even bother with the vertical count, and I'll just count. Okay, there are 20 stitches in this 4 inches, and I divide those numbers. Okay, don't lose me here. This is very basic math, and you got this. So if I have 20 stitches per 4 inches, what I'm gonna do is take my number of stitches, 20, and I'm going to divide it by the number of inches that I measured, which is 4. And that gives you the stitch per inch. In this case, it would be 5. 20 divided by 4 is 5. So I have 5 stitches per inch. We're on the same page here. This also works with centimeters. So if I had 20 stitches per 10 centimeters, then I would have 2 stitches per centimeter. Now we take this number and we apply it to the template we have already filled in. So if I have 5 stitches per inch, if I know that my sweater needs to be 20 inches wide or 40 inches in circumference, around the body, then I just need to multiply the number I just calculated by this other number on the template here. So if it's 5 stitches per inch and I need it to be 40 inches, then I multiply 40 by 5. And I think that's 200. So if I was working bottom up, I would cast on 200 stitches. I'll be honest, when I'm working top down, I usually just wing it. But you can go ahead and measure the necklines on different sweaters you have. If I'm working top down, then I will measure the circumference of different necklines in my wardrobe and seeing what neckline opening size do I want. And same principle here. So if the opening needs to be 12 inches in circumference, then I would just multiply the 5 by 12. And I think that's 60. So I would cast on 60 stitches to do the neckline. What are we on? Phase 4? Phase 4. Actually making the thing. Again, I just want to repeat, this is my approach. This is not the end all be all how you should self-draft. This is just the way that I do it. Usually I'm doing top down. I know how many stitches I wanted to cast on. I have my construction picked out. So for my neckline, if I'm casting on 60 stitches around the neckline, and I happen to know for raglans, I want it to be like a 4-stitch seam, I'll place my little stitch markers around. That's the kind of thing where you look up a video of how to do raglan construction and you just do whatever that video tells you to do. So at this point, you are just at the mercy of whatever construction you are following, moving along through that process. I can't give specific advice because I don't know what construction you have picked in your head, and this would be an 8-hour video if I were to explain how to do every single knitting construction. This would be an 80-hour video. But some general advice and tips during the phase where you're actually making the item is to fit check as you go and expect going in that you are going to have to do some sections multiple times. Often when I am casting on the neckline, once I've done a couple inches, I will try it on and then I can really get a feel for, oh, you know what? That neckline was actually a little bit tighter than I was expecting. I think I want to redo that and add some more stitches for the neckline and restart with that in mind, which is why I recommend doing top down when you're starting to self-draft. Another tip that I actually haven't heard anyone say, and some people disagree with this, I swear by this, wet block as you go. If you are nervous about the fit for something, when I am in between phases of the sweater, I wet block that bad boy. So once I'm done with the yoke, before I go to split for sleeves, I wet block that because I want to know for a fact before moving on that it is the fit I want it to be. Because often when I go to wet block, I'll be like, oh wow, that shrunk a lot. I need to do a lot more rounds to get that yoke to be the size I want it to be. Or I'll find out, wow, that grew a lot. I'm going to peel back a little bit here. The portions where I tend to wet block would be right when I'm about to split for sleeves, I will wet block. And then before I am binding off on the bottom or about to do the bottom ribbing or whatever kind of flare you're putting at the bottom of your sweater, I'll wet block before doing that to make sure it's the correct length that I want it to be. And then same thing when I go to do the sleeves, took me a while to find that word, I will wet block before I bind off for the sleeves. So 3 different wet blocking sessions before I've actually finished the piece. I don't do this every single time, but I honestly should. Every time I do it, I get the best fit because I know exactly how that sweater is going to fit before it's finished. Phase 5, finishes. This is probably the shortest phase. When you're done, wet block that bad boy or steam block. I guess it depends on what kind of yarn you're using, I should say. Basically, try it on. Does it all fit good? Great. You're basically done. And then consider if you want to add any finishing touches, little embroidery, tags. If you're gift knitting it, you can watch my Gift Knit 101 video to get some more specific advice for finishing touches when it comes to gift knitting for other people, adding care instructions. And the literal last step is to put on your sweater and wear it proudly and show it off to everyone you've ever met because you deserve it, because you just self-drafted your own sweater, which is awesome. There are lots of reasons why I self-draft. I find it to be I'll often self-draft because I got an idea and I want that sweater to exist in the universe, but there are no existing patterns that follow what I have in my mind. Sometimes I see something in a store that I really like and I would just change a couple things about it. And so I'll try to just execute that vision. A really awesome reason to self-draft is to just get more intimate with the sweater construction process. It makes me a better knitter and crocheter when I self-draft because I understand or start learning sweater construction theory. How do pieces go together? When I make this fit change, what does that do? If I make this area bigger or smaller or increase at this rate, what does that do? And messing around and playing with different ideas. This is what people did in the 1800s pre-Ravelry existing. And I think it's why people were so gifted and skilled. It all around makes me better at what I'm doing. And also just know that the more you self-draft, the easier it gets. I am just jubilated when I think of what kind of knitting and crochet I'll be able to do in 50 years if I keep up with this hobby. Like, before I leave you be, some general tips that I have to offer. For people that want to get really familiar with different sweater constructions, I would highly recommend going to Ravelry, looking at a picture of a sweater, and in your mind trying to identify how do you think that was made, and then clicking on it, reading the description to like see if they tell you. So being able to look at something and know that's a raglan sweater. They probably did like 4 or 5 stitches on the raglan seam, and it's just like a little pop quiz flashcard way of getting to know different construction options off the top of your head, because being able to identify it makes it really easy for you to take an idea and make a sweater out of it. I feel like that's the hardest part. It's not that hard to make a sweater. It's a little bit more difficult to have an idea and execute it the way that you pictured it. Find inspiration from alternative resources, so looking at vintage patterns, but also steering away from knitting in general. I find a lot of inspiration from like looking at architecture, interior design, runway fashion, art from different artists, paintings, movies. Like, there's just so many different sources of inspiration out there that I find amazing. Like, if you just gave someone the prompt, hey, knit a sweater based on the movie Encanto, I think it'd be interesting to see what someone came up with. I've mentioned this earlier, but definitely considering looking at resources. There are plenty of free resources available for finding different stitch techniques, construction techniques. There are books and Pinterest pins and videos on YouTube. It's just good to have a collection of resources that you can go to as a reference when you go to come up with an idea or self-draft a pattern. Play around, have fun, experiment, do poorly, fail. Do you know how many self-drafted sweaters I have unraveled? You don't, because I haven't shown them to you, but it's a lot. For every sweater I have that has turned out good, I have likely unraveled many portions of that sweater many times. So just like go easy on yourself and know that it takes a couple tries to get it right sometimes. A lot of times. And the last thing I will say is you do not have to self-draft to be considered a real knitter or a real crocheter. Some people just genuinely don't like it. You can even want to do it, but hate the process of it. And that's okay. So that's it. I would say people who have never self-drafted before, who might still have some remaining questions at the end of this video, put your questions down in the comments. People who have self-drafted before or are really comfortable with knitting, go ahead and answer those questions for people, or add some other additional advice that I did not touch on or cover. Maybe what's your approach and is it different than mine? I think it's interesting how people's brains work a little bit differently, because to me, this makes sense. This is like easy peasy, the best way to approach self-drafting, but someone else could self-draft a ton and look at this process and be like, that is not how I do it at all. If you have access to a feline that is not feral and is fairly docile, go ahead and pet that feline today or tell them that they're pretty. Otherwise, end of video.
Your eyes tell me that you don't want to leave just yet. No, my eyes agree. It's almost like when we first met. Oh, I don't care, it's getting too late. I want you and I can't wait. Don't want to spend a minute without you. I know you feel the same.